Hello everybody, this is Project Alpha, my name is Nikolai Feldman and you're watching War Diary Day 761 with Alexey Arestovich, Lieutenant Colonel, ex-advisor to the Office of the President of Ukraine. Hello? Alexey. Hello. So, I think the last week added more escalation into the conflict that is going between Ukraine and Russia. There was a terrorist act on the territory of Russia. There was another missile barrage on the cities of Ukraine. And that surprised a lot of people because I think hypersonic missile use of on Kyiv is a pretty rare occasion. Or maybe I'm wrong. No, here wrong, yeah, they used it quite a few times. We just were shooting it down usually. And today we shot it down again. But what did the Russians do? They picked a moment. Sorry, my phone is almost out of battery. Cannot do it. Cannot do the stream without it. So sorry for the wires connecting stuff here. So they picked the moment. They were accumulating their reserves for quite some time. And now they're picking the window when we have fewer missiles for air defense, because America is still not sending anything. And they also, they have accumulated, as I said, enough. So I think we should expect a few missile attacks one after another in the next few days. Yeah, so peculiarity of this hit was what, maybe 10 seconds window between the siren and the explosions. We missed when they launched it. Oh no, we did not miss, but the speed of approach is very high. Plus, first you need to trace it, catch it when it's launched, then you have to transfer the data and give the warning sign to the sirens and all. So that takes some time, and you have seconds, literally. And another peculiarity of that strike was that, according to some media, the target was high-ranking Ukraine military officials. And by the way, today is the day of Ukraine Armed Forces, so we need to congratulate them as well. And I would say that when it is a holiday of a certain service, like Armed Forces, that it's very likely that there'll be some other leadership present at the location with the top leadership of that service. So there is a probability that they could be somebody from government together with our military leaders. So that's somewhat a new phase in escalation. There is no exact data, but calculating the trajectory, one can say that they have been shooting at the center of our decisions a few times before. Today, definitely we can say they were targeting a certain location with our military leadership, so Russia crossed another line with their escalations. Or how it is sarcastically called, they crossed another brown line. Look, on one hand, we are brought up in the myth about the total war, like Second World War. This is our archetypical war. And to all Russian-speaking peoples, it is a pinnacle of different kinds of war. This is not exactly so. Clausewitz has a definition of the ideal war. Ideal war is when the whole effort, 100% of society's effort is engaged in this war. Not a single war went all 100% in. Even, let's take Soviet Union. In the Second World War, they used not more than 85% of their might fighting it. We had huge detachments in the Soviet Union on the Far East that were standing there throughout the whole war. They were fighting with Japanese at the end of it, but they were not engaged in the war with Germany. And not all military capabilities were used. United States used maybe half of what they have capacity-wise, maybe 60 at max. Even Hitler Germany did not use 100%. Maybe the last year they got close to about 80% or 70%. So even our war cannot go at 100% effectiveness. Not everybody will be participating. We have to put the troops in different parts of the border, like Transnistria, like Belarus border, where there are no hot actions currently. And Putin keeps talking about negotiations. So usually when you want negotiations, you don't hit the ones you want to negotiate with. Because even if your hands are itching and you want to liquidate your opponent, you still would have to talk to him if you fail to do that, right? So these lines in modern warfare are usually not crossed, but will not put an exclamation sign here, we'll put a question mark. Was that an attack on our military and political leadership today in Kyiv? And if they made a decision to do that, they will likely continue. We'll see more. I'm sneezing. I probably might be speaking the truth. And I think, yeah, we'll see that in the future days to come. So in this logic about paradoxical begging for negotiations when they ask for that, and then they still try to hit everybody who can be representing Ukraine in these negotiations. Putin ignored himself the signals that he was getting from the West leadership about possible terrorist activities in Russia. So did he fail to control or allowed for it to happen? And then this terrorist act in Crocus was allowed to happen? Right, and Russian FSB then complained that signals from the West were not clear or sharp enough. Right, very specific attempt to remove responsibility from your shoulders onto somebody else. Here one can say that Russia is conducting the biggest war in its recent history against Ukraine, and currently FSB is really engaged in torturing somebody on the newly occupied territories, or is trying to put somebody for 7 years for protesting against the war. They're spread too thin to really attack the real perpetrators of terrorist activities. And what analysts can notice here that the whole Russian leadership was quiet for about 24 to 48 hours, some of them, after this act happened. And now they're talking about, well, the terrorists were leaving towards Ukraine when they actually were going towards Belarus border, and they were captured closer to that. So, not to go into much details, it seems that their reaction is a mix of falsities, unnecessary details, compliments to each other. They're trying to congratulate everybody with their successful activities, but that outlines that they really do not have to say anything at large. And they don't have that because if you look at the whole Russian propaganda, they've been fighting, according to propaganda, with Muslim terrorists in Caucasus. Every year there are at least 100 troops from different kinds are dying there. 2 Chechen wars there. For 22 years, Russia, with the whole world, was fighting terrorist Islam. And they supposedly have won, and Putin awarded a lot of people, and what? And on the backdrop that they promised, ISIS has promised new terrorist activities on the territory of Russia, it looks puzzling, right? It's the first time in recent history when terrorist organization says, we did that, and the anti-terrorist group in the country is saying, no, it's not you, these are Ukrainians, and pointing finger at us. Then ISIS comes out again and shows more proof, shows additional materials, the video from the camera of one of the terrorists. And no, KGB comes out and says again, no, it's not you, we know it's Ukrainians. Then ISIS comes out and says, we'll do more terrorist activities if you don't believe us. And FSB is still resisting and saying, no, it's very unlikely that it's you. So that's unusual. Usually terrorist groups either don't take or take responsibility for different actions, but there was no time in history when they took responsibility and FSB in return says, no, it's not you. One could think that they maybe are doing proper due diligence to verify things, but it's not so. It's just because everything is messy there. And if you look at their propaganda machine, several hours before terrorist activities, they were talking about escalation of war with Ukraine. I think personally this is just an overlap, that 2 events coincided, but I can imagine that FSB officers reading this telegram and propaganda media and seeing that, well, it looks like we got a new order to talk about Ukraine, so let's support, let's look at where they were living and say that it's not ISIS, that it's maybe some ties to Ukraine. And then ISIS had to come out several times to reaffirm their engagement until Putin 48 hours later had acknowledged that it is radical Islam. So they're so head up their ass in fighting with Ukraine that when the real factor of danger appeared for them inside the territory of Russia, for 48 hours they failed to even make a proper judgment. For 2 days they were puzzled. For a fighting country, this is an unforgiving situation, and we're not even talking about having them lost a bunch of different services during war in Ukraine because everybody's engaged here in war. So they missed a bunch of opportunities to resist and to stop this terrorist act as it was unfolding. So whoever is left there in Russia, they can maybe attack a blogger for a wrong like, but they would not rush to interrupt anything where there are 4 armed men shooting things up. So imagine that this factor starts to develop systemically. I think American embassy announced that citizens of US should be leaving the territory of Russia in the next 48 hours or taking care because there are threats coming from ISIS again. So that's the crowning achievement for Putin's 20 years of fight with terrorism. It does not correlate with the current war efforts that he is exerting, and it doesn't correlate with the wave of sympathy from the West, because the West apparently warned Russia about this act, and then they also expressed sympathy to the victims. Russia is supposedly fighting NATO at large, but NATO came out with condolences to the victims of this terrorist act. So this whole story is destroying Putin's grand narrative of Russian propaganda. And they, as little children, throwing a tantrum, asking for compassion, telling the whole world that you need to be on our side, you need to express your condolences, that we are victims of radical Islam, forgetting that they're killing as many Ukrainians in a 24-hour period as they got killed during this terrorist act. And if you take Bucha, Mariupol, and some other episodes of this war, we have not heard too much condolences from Russia about that. And then they also reach out to Ukraine, and you can watch the conversations between people online and otherwise, that they're surprised that Ukraine is not expressing any condolences to them. Just remember stories about little kids sitting in the basement with the dead body of their grandma when both parents were killed in an attack, and a lot of stories like that. Split families, killed civilians. Where were their condolences? Right, so this is almost a psychiatry book and psychology studies. They accuse us and the whole world in what they are doing here in this war. And when that happens to them, they throw a tantrum and demand some attention. So this is a psychiatric version of infantilism. And when they get not enough condolences and sympathy, or very reserved sympathies, then they scream louder that you're all horrible people, you're horrible creatures, you don't have hearts. And in the meantime, they're hitting Kyiv during the daytime. They're hitting the targets next to the schools, to the kindergartens, and this is somewhat a norm for them. Right, so when their civilians die, this is so bad. When they kill civilians in Ukraine aplenty daily, then this is a norm. So we saw again that Russian special services and leadership is not ready to deal with another systemic factor that raised its head. And we also see the attitude of their society and special services that it's got to be Ukrainians, and then they're posturing and begging for sympathy on the global arena. And the third element is that the captures of those people whom they declared to be the executors of this event in Crocus, you can see how beaten they were, the ears cut off, the beaten up faces, and the knife at the end being sold, auctioned off somewhere. So I just want to say that no, that's not how you do that. This is so bad. Even official organs of Russian Federation are behaving like terrorists of the lowest grade. They're publishing these videos, and picture after picture, the executors look worse and worse. And then somehow the knife that executors supposedly used is being sold, auctioned off. And literally, people were making analysis, looking at the faces and the condition of those people whom they captured, that picture after picture, hour after hour, they were looking poorer and more beaten up. And so in this fashion, there probably would be just some chunks of meat when they'll be going through the official court proceedings. So that tells you that Russia went down to some caveman level of systems. Just one terrorist act highlighted all the issues their current systems have. Full dependency on the official and unofficial propaganda, systemic terror of their own population and everybody they can reach, corruption of a very high degree. Experts already talking about the Crocus Center burning to the ground, not for no reasons. They're probably either faulty systems or there were reasons for it to let it burn. So the mass psychosis is really raging in Russia at the moment, when the methods of terror are not just hidden, when the system overuses its power, they're not concealed, they're actually brandished, and they're showing what and how they do it. Just one terrorist activity highlighted that. Imagine if that becomes a new systemic factor, and ISIS has promised more and promised revenge for the torture of their adepts. So we'll see what Putin's Russia will do with this factor. Because the game that they tried to play with the West, that they can create additional conflict in Ukraine, they can ignite a conflict in Israel, the Hussites can come out, and maybe something else, some other place they can light the fire up. This apparently is now backfiring because ISIS and other so-called friends in quotes of Russia can do the same to Russia. And let's see how Russia can resist it, because if ISIS will seriously start working on the Russian territory, how they can, it will be a very interesting picture. It's very unclear how far things can deteriorate. But just to compare, in the Soviet Union, KGB apparatus was only 90,000 people. FSB, before Russia invaded Ukraine, was only in the central command about 120,000. It's more than the entire Soviet Union, given that Russia is smaller and is not conducting politics, not throughout the world like USSR did. And they also have diminished the service of international intel activities that is not part of it. So they missed, with all that, they still missed the activity of ISIS, and that they've been warned about, actually. And they will likely miss the next one too. So I'm picking words not to say some expletives about how do I think about it. So, okay, thank you, Alexey. Comment one question in this context. What they tried to interpret in favor of Ukraine, that it's Ukraine behind this event in Crocus City Hall. Does it explain that additional hits, airstrikes on Kyiv and other cities that they're conducting, does it indicate that they're actually walking the escalation ladder up? And the messages that you talked about, Telegram channels on the same day of Crocus, that they were going to escalate things, what branch of escalations are they talking about? Well, they were giddy about attacks on the hydroelectric plant in our territory, Zaporozhye. And it, I think, was their moment to be giddy, because they knew that our capabilities to defend our air is weaker now. Otherwise, they don't really have much more escalation. They can just change the set of targets. They have started attacking our military political leadership openly now. To call it a new stage of war, I think that would be an exaggeration. From real escalation means they only have nukes. And, I mean, they can try. What do you think the consequences of that would be? I think America and NATO will engage in this war after that. It could be a limited operation about destroying Russian troops in Ukraine or destroying the detachment that used nukes. But the consequences will be rather catastrophic for Putin's regime. So I don't think they will ever go for it. And China is also very much against that. One thing is for them fighting the West. They are mad enough, but fighting against or objecting to China, that's a whole other level. We have a real example, by the way, when the West stomped its foot loudly enough and started slapping actions for gray operations and trade with Russia of certain articles. India withdrew from purchasing oil and China stopped supplying certain goods. For them, it's very uncomfortable, but still, after receiving the signal from the West, they stopped doing it. And this is not even nukes. This is just stopping gray trade schemes, counterfeit schemes for oil and other supplies. What would happen, do you think, if there is a real use of nukes? Russia may find itself, Mother Russia will find itself alone and without any allies. China continuously keeps saying no, anything but nukes. So I can say here in the West, they stopped being afraid of it at large, and some actually hotshots are waiting for Russia to do something like this so they can retaliate and respond. So this is only propaganda machine, I think. The fact that they attacked the dam, they're forgetting about Novokakhovskaya dam that they blew up, right? What else can they escalate, those clowns? So the common conclusion to that would be just posturing to express as if it is some novelty on the front. Right, this is just posturing. This is just posturing for the picture. As one Soviet Union colonel said in Great Britain, when we were talking about some things on a conference, he said that Russia is an industrial factory for producing posturing. And that's what is being spread in their propaganda, and all the Telegram channels and the TVs and radios. So they're changing tactics, they're trying new targets. And yeah, today's strikes, they're not even equal to how much they hit us in 22nd. But even back then, when we had very few resources, we managed to shoot down most of their missiles. So, not a real escalation. Otherwise. All right, let's comment on the front, on the situation there. Yeah, we can look at the key points. Okay, let's go from Kharkov region. Operation of Russian Voluntary Corps and Legion of Russia had distracted their efforts near Kupyansky, and it was quieter than normal. We indeed got some respite there on the Kupyansky front, and we will continue fighting as well. I know RDK and Legion of Russia will continue plucking at them on their territory, so it's the same group that is attacking Kupyansky is in charge of defending Russia in that region. So as long as there are operations happening on their territory, their aviation and their artillery is distracted for the raids of Legion of Russia. So for now, it's a bit of a quieter. Near Svatova, again, they're still fighting, but there's no major pressure. So if you go lower, there is a more active attempt to push to Zarechna, and that's what they're doing. They need to keep the flank there, so they continue exerting systemic pressure near Zarechna. Chasov Yar, of course, is the next one under their pressure from Bakhmut to the west, and here it is. And here in the green area, Klishivka and Avdeevka, this is where they still exert systemic effort. They've taken the railroad back and they want to push further beyond it. Let's go next, Avdeevka direction, where they're trying to continue their offensive on the shoulders of our withdrawing troops. It did not quite work, and now the fighting continues around Semenovka and Orlovka line. In Ugledar, they're still trying to cut the effort of our troops to hold that birch and to provide their flanks on the road to Kurakhova at the bottom, and to, of course, remove us further from their railroad. And Ugledar is a bit less pressure. Now there is more, here you can see, towards Kurakhova in the upper left corner. And Rabotino, they're still trying to push us out. It is somewhat intensive, but one cannot say that there is a new group or a new effort to take it back. One cannot say that. According to some data, they'll probably continue throwing more troops there, but for now it's unclear. And Krynki, we have probably a new set of cyborgs defending that area on our side, which is now probably competing with Donetsk airport episode of the early stage of this war back in 2014. And I don't want to give exact numbers of our troops, but it's a very minimal number that is holding huge camp of Russians on this side. And they continue trying to push us back into the river, but we're holding. In the Institute of Research of War, they were commenting the question about Russia being ready for the next stage, about 300,000 new troops being used maybe to take Kharkov back. So the Institute denounces that statement, says Russia is not ready for anything like that. Nikolai will face that trash information injection for quite a few more times this year. 300,000, that's a half of what they currently have in Ukraine. Do you think if they had it really, they would be holding it? Any somewhat significant reserves, according to calculations of Russian command, they will have their hands on them probably only by middle of the summer. And that's only if everything goes smooth with recruitment, with training, and material supplies, which is also quite a difficult thing to solve. Right, so they can maybe form another army corps, maybe a couple more divisions, but Russia forming the whole two armies by the end of this year, that claim is laughable. They do not have capacity to do anything like that. They do not have Soviet Union capacity to form troops at that tempo. And even Soviet Union would have issues creating two new armies within such a time frame. And here we have semi-dead Russia that uplifts maybe 200 tanks from storage in 12 months and refurbishes for the front. Now that they would somehow find ways to form 14 new divisions, of course not. And there would be a lot of panicky pieces of information in news and media. They'll be scaring us with Kharkov, they'll be scaring us with Kyiv attacks, that everybody needs to fuel their vehicles and flee. Russia is trying to exert cognitive warfare. They're trying to work with rumors. I would say they will undoubtedly fail with that, but we'll just learn to see through these falsities. So about these new armies that Shoigu talked about, intel services of Britain are saying that Russia has the capacity to draft that many, but they do not have enough technical capabilities to equip them. Right now they can probably draft the whole mobilization resource of their, 15 million, 5 million? But what do you arm them with? Okay, let's develop the topic with France. Last week we talked a lot about Macron, his behavior in relation to the war with Ukraine, and his statements about sending French troops to Ukraine. This week he laughed at the Speaker of Congress of Russian Federation, who threatened to kill all French soldiers. Peter Tolstoy, Vice Speaker of Russian Congress, had promised to kill all the French soldiers if they arrived to the territory of Ukraine. Macron reacted to that and said that he would like to express his surprise to such nervousness and lack of honor within Russian bureaucracy that tells a lot about the current level of Russia. And I think this is a continuation of cognitive war. The rumors in Ukraine, verbal attacks on France. How much do you think statements by Russian congressmen can affect the opinion of French people? How Macron is working to balance it? I think Macron will deal with them just fine. This is a collection of mad circus that's called Russian politicians. I think France sees that just fine. You can just show a few clips by Rogozin and then show the ear cut off from one of the people they captured after Crocus. Everything is getting put in place. And It may happen so that in an attempt to kill one French soldier, Russia will lose 10 of its own. So, it's always both ways. And I would say that even though Russian army may exceed French army quantitatively, qualitatively, they're nowhere near. And if there'll be participants of other countries, and of course our troops in Ukraine, there'll not be any chance for Russia to do what Tolstoy promised. And they're like new nobility over there in Putin's Russia. They're allowing themselves to spew all these things because they know they're unpunishable and they're supporting the General Putin's line. Russia is deteriorating really rapidly on all the different angles that you can take, all different sectors you can analyze. Even that public rhetoric about propaganda is surprising sometimes. Pavel Tolstoy, he used to be working with CE, he was talking in European Parliament before, and now he's making statements like that. So that's a degradation. They're competing with their Medvedev. That's their overall bar that keeps falling. Medvedev sets the falling bar, and now they all start diving under. So when it falls to the bottom, they try to find a new bottom to go deeper. And that's Russian public rhetoric. And their well-known joke about, we thought we reached the bottom, but then somebody knocked from below, that's what's kind of happening there. They're going deeper, deeper, and deeper. And they have some pretense to occupy a multipolar world, to be a power, a superpower that throws a gauntlet to other major powers to be. And in reality, they're not even thugs. They're even below that. So they're marginalizing themselves at a surprising pace. And their rhetoric, I think, blows back. And French people who they would have thought would be scared, they start to understand that Russians are just mad. And perhaps start thinking that Macron might be right to put them in their place. And they might start to support Macron better, or at least not to curse him much. And I think that'll be enough for him to fare. All right, but there are still people in French society, Alexey, who express other thoughts, right? And I got this week some bits and pieces from some of their comedians who was saying absolutely reverse message. He said that Macron made a decision to go fight against Russians. I will go too, but against Macron. And when he was asked, if you have a choice to fight for France or France becomes Russian, what would you choose? So he answered, well, my name is Sergei and where's my hat? So he's kind of nodding to Putin that he is not against France becoming more Russian-like. And according to reaction in the audience, he is somewhat liked. Well, Nikolai, this is stand-up comedy, right? Sometimes they hit some real pain points. You understand? Even the statement by Marie Le Pen, who supported Macron, being his main opponent, right? She got, what, 42% versus his 45%, with about 3% difference. But one of their stand-up comics actually is hitting that pain point. And okay, fantastic. But I would say that the main point here, the main takeaway point is that when society can laugh like that, when society can afford itself to have stand-up comedians laughing this up, it means that society is alive, it's living and breathing, that they can attack a comedian or they can attack a commander-in-chief or president, and you can express that you will be siding with Putin if there is a conflict. And if you look at the other side, there is a stand-up comedian in Russia. Imagine one coming out and saying that my name is Jean, and in the war between Putin and Macron, I'll be on the side of Macron, and let Russia become French territory like it was at some point. So what do you think will happen to that comedian after that? Yeah? When they recently, for a simple nude party organized by Avdeevka, people were pressed so hard that they all had to apologize and come out and express their sorries about it. So Russian society is different. And that's why I'm saying France is a very living and breathing society, and Russian society is decaying corpse. And they're dying. It's very much fitting the inhabited island by Strugatskis. When the towers are turned into super patriotism wavelength, sooner or later people start going mad because events in their life contradict the messages they keep hearing. And that goes against logic and what they actually see. It's like you use propaganda to imprint on the hungry one that he is not hungry, and then at the end of it he'll go insane. And that's what Strugatsky brothers were describing in their sci-fi. That's roughly what is happening in Russia now. This is colossal mass psychosis with a lot of deterioration of individual psyches, with the loss of cause and effect relationships. It's almost a prohibited subject in Russia. They do not understand or fail to understand that they are killing daily dozens of civilians in Ukraine. And with that, if you spread all the casualties through days, take all the casualties in Mariupol and just all together casualties in Ukraine, divided by the amount of days that the war was raging, they just ignore it. It'll be even higher number. And with this, they're saying, well, don't look there, but please give us some pity to our current situation with the Crocus and the terrorist attack there. Well, they've been terrorizing their neighbors since at least 1994. And if you count Afghanistan, that'll be over 40 years of terror. And in Afghanistan, on the preliminary estimates, they were about 1 million casualties due to Soviet Union. So what mercy, what compassion, what are you looking for, right? They were given enough face slaps today. Today Germans were speaking in their parliament and they were saying that, of course, we do send our condolences to the relatives of the victims of the terrorist activity, especially when there are little kids left and their parents died going to that concert. Of course, execution of citizens, civilians is horrible. And as a process, however, one of the German congressmen said, we do condemn terrorism and we do feel pity for the victims of terror. But you guys are sowing that wind. You're reaping that fruit. You're reaping that storm because you've sown that terror. Yeah, indeed, Alexey. Joseph Borrell said also in Europe that we should not be dying for Donbass, but he thinks that EU needs to still help Ukraine. However, he does not think that the war between EU and Russia is inevitable, and he is against this point. He is saying that this is not true. They are not a part of this possible war and conflict. We're just supporting Ukraine, and we need to make sure our industrial complex is ready to provide enough support to whatever circumstance happens, but we are not considering that the war with Russia is inevitable. So, Alexey, do you think this position of the European diplomat is good? What do you think about it? Do you think he needs to continue scaring his people or to keep pacifying them? Well, it's not about scaring people at this point, right? EU is rather big. They have a lot of contradictions, different wills, different goals. For example, do you think Portugal needs to be afraid of war with Russia? I think everybody needs to be informed, right, that it's possible. Do you think Estonia needs to be concerned about war with Russia? Same as Portugal, right? Different stories. For example, Sweden and Italy, they have different stories on this account. So these are very different aspects, different sides, and they all need to be informed, in my opinion. They shouldn't be afraid, they shouldn't be scared. But what and how are you going to inform them? Are you going to judge the capabilities or the intentions? I recently had a good conversation with some high-ranking, knowledgeable people, and we were talking about different arguments. They were actually following our conversations here with you rather closely. So they said that among the list of different arguments that we used, you know which one was most efficient? The one when I said, when you calculate Russian losses calculate how much of the mobilization potential do they capture on the Ukrainian territories that they acquired. And they are already using Ukrainians, citizens of Ukraine until recently, to fight against Ukraine now on the front. And that message actually went deep. They got it. They're rather rational. They understand that the relation between jets and shells and bullets, they run these numbers. So this proposition actually did ring a bell, and they had to correct their analytics. Where you can catch West is that they are too rational. They do not quite get our Slavic actions outside of rationality. And what I'm saying is that we really start things when we go beyond the rationality. You know, when I once flew to Tbilisi after a long trip, I came to the hotel and said, do you think I still can have dinner somewhere at midnight in Tbilisi? And I got a smile back and said, well, dear, at midnight everything is only starting in Tbilisi. So that's where the logical West fails, because very often we go into the area of irrational. But they do have their strength in calculating the relations. And you do not need to tell them a lot about the intentions of Russian Federation, but you can highlight the correlation of possible powers of both sides. For example, calculate Russian aviation and joint aviation of EU, even without United States. 4,000 jets of fourth or fifth generation, they can convince most people. However, you can highlight that they have deficiencies in infantry or ground vehicles, and they can start working in fixing that. And when they communicate that language to their people, they do not need to scare anybody. A rather rational European citizen will understand that Europe is generally ready for war with Russia, but there are certain limitations that they need to rectify, and they're trying to do that rather quickly right now. So EU was not ready in terms of intentions, and that was our target starting about September. Now that everything did change, and the intention is not only confirmed behind the screens, it's also declared out in the open that EU will fight if they need to fight. Did you notice that all the equipment on the eastern border is being moved during the daytime? So they're demonstratively showing to Russia the tanks and soldiers and other equipment moving to the border. They're showing that if need be, they will fight. And if they need to fight without United States, they will fight without United States. So this is a strategic turn that changed quite a few things, because they had certain issues in September. They had enough technical capabilities, ballpark, but they had issues with intention and being ready for that. But now that it is being announced and declared, it's a different story. Now, from this position, from this rhetoric, it's easier to communicate to citizens that the war is possible. The reason for this war is aggressive politics of Putin and Kremlin in Moscow. We'll do everything to prevent it, but the best way to prevent a war is to prepare for it to the best of our ability. So all our military measures are related to making sure this war doesn't happen, which is basically a first function of military. Few civilians understand that the main function of military is not fighting the war, but preventing the war from happening. Your military needs to be so strong that the enemy looking at them would just not even consider attacking you. And that's what you highlight, that you're strengthening the first function of military of EU and NATO. And for this, a lot more needs to be invested. And I want to say that there will be investments in short terms. They're already on the way. Speaking of 4,000 jets, by the way, you did mention it in last stream or a stream before that. There was a lot of criticism from the Russian audience in particular. They do not believe that. They're saying that this is fake data. They're saying that these jets don't exist. Well, you don't need to believe. It's not your aviation, it's battle aviation of NATO. They are never 100% ready, but they're generally in a ready state. And even if it's 70% of the official numbers, just run it across different countries. You can open some statistics online. That's all there. From me, I have a question for you, Alexey. I remember that at the beginning of that full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine, control of the airspace was a very detailed subject of study for the Institute of War and other analysts. who were saying that even if Russia failed to acquire full domination in air, this will happen in the next few weeks. But then it turned out that Russia doesn't really have enough pilots who could use all that possible potential of Russian Air Force that is technically available for them, that could participate at the same time in so many flights that are needed to control, perform dozens of flights a day. Do you think in EU they have this capability, pilot-wise? Do you think they have enough manpower and that is well trained and knows how to interact with each other?
Well, of course they do. Let's do some basic training in aviation. Aviation is most useful when it can carry out large-scale operations, 80 to 120 planes operations, when they can carry out missile or bombing operations or attack operations of that large scale. For that, all Air Force needs to be trained to a certain high level, from the last technician to the commander, so they do not have to be a hodgepodge of several different generations of military thought and military training operating different generations of hardware. Last time we've seen operations of that scale were in Iraq and Yugoslavia. And Air Force needs to have enough funding, needs to be well trained in working together with other branches of military. So I always suggest to understand what is military aviation, right? There are probably among our viewers some of those who are afraid of flying on the planes, right? Now imagine that you're not taking off yourself, you're taking off with other flyers and you have several jets next to you. And every maneuver is carrying a risk of possibly colliding, a possible collision, possible disaster. Now imagine you look one side, there is a jet to the right, then you look to the left, there is another one to the left, then you look around, there are 70 more. And you're flying somewhere to hit certain targets, and then you either have other jets intercepting you or you start being attacked from ground. And this attack at you can be done, or that fight can be done at a distance of dozens of kilometers in modern days, but imagine now everybody's maneuvering, trying to avoid collision. This is a nightmare for a usual person, for a usual layman who is not trained to do that, to fight like that. So it takes years to train a pilot to be effective in these conditions. And a good pilot is probably 10 to 15 years of very thorough training and huge expenditures on them. And in order for Americans to fine-tune their aviation, they had to fight the Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam War. At the end of it, they got, after all of the expenses, huge expenses, if you calculate how much was spent on American Air Force, it was hundreds and hundreds of billions to make sure they know how to suppress enemy ground defense forces, how they win advantage in air over other Air Force. And yet, remember 91, even Iraq aviation was a definite blip on the radar. How much pain did it cause? And even in Yugoslavia, F-117 was shot down, which is supposed to be invisible for usual means. So this is a long and difficult story. Nothing like that is available in Russia, unlike NATO countries and United States as part of NATO, because in NATO countries, aviation is one of the main elements of the joint military operation. And that's where they invest colossal amounts of money to make sure that the level doesn't drop, the level of training doesn't fall, because it's easy to lose it, to skip it, and then you'll have to invest even more. That's why French Air Force is a very well-trained group of fighters, and I'm not even talking about other countries. So for some comparison, Finland right now is purchasing 64 F-35s, and they have 180 of F-18s, and that's just Finland. And all that can work as a system combined. During all that time, we have not seen any joint aerial strike by Russian aviation on our position. And I'm talking about 16 to 18 jets at a time, right? None of those operations were carried out. One, maybe two. maybe 6 on some occasions, and maybe on the whole front they had maybe 12 on a large-scale distance. They are not well trained to be close to each other as one group, and they cannot isolate a battlefield, a certain battlefield, from support, one of the tasks of the Air Force. And we're not even talking about the whole depth of operational activity, as even Russian doctrine recommends them to, that they can cut supply lines from a certain part of the front all the way down to 120 or 250 kilometers, so no supplies can come in. So aviation serves essentially like a surgeon's scalpel in this way, cutting it out from the enemy's access, and then ground forces finishing off the job there. They are nowhere near with carrying this capability. And NATO aviation has demonstrated it many times, suppressing Air Force, suppressing air defense systems, isolating the battlefield. So these are very incomparable. We can predict that if Western aviation, Western Air Force collides with Russian would be defeated in a very short time scale. Russia has advantage on the ground, still, to a certain degree. And even then, let's put it differently, Russia has a capability to conduct longer conflicts on the ground with higher level of exertion, carrying out certain losses in the current conditions. What happens when they face NATO or EU? What other sanctions will be implemented if that happens? Even the secondary and tertiary, how much pressure would be put on gray schemas in this case? And then in the case of potentials, is it global South versus global Europe? For example, there is a real fight of NATO with Russia. How would China and global South react to that? Because in India and other countries, Russia might just stay with North Korea then. And China is mostly connected to the West because of their supply. They're a manufacturing hub for a lot of Western countries. So if they lose that, what happens? So China will have to make certain hard decisions. India also, I predict, will probably be abstaining from any support of Russia. And Russia will be defeated militarily on the battlefield, and then we'll be talking about ultimatum. And the question will be how much NATO and EU ready for nuclear ultimatum. And if the answer is yes, what we're seeing now, then the point of that ultimatum disappears. So NATO can rather quickly bring Russia back to a Stone Age, but will there be enough will on Russian side to give everybody a rifle and ill-equipped and ill-dressed to send them out to fight in somewhere in NATO territory? That may cause other issues and other problems in Russia if their military system and economy collapse. So, 11,000 tomahawks in a first volley, you cannot circumnavigate that. That's a serious obstacle. In Crimea, we had how many missile hits? 30. We destroyed their central command, main fuel dumps, some jets on the airfield. 3 Su-27s are probably hit by shrapnel, and that was just 30, all in all. The first volley from the Mediterranean, if NATO decides to shoot up Putin's forces, there'll be, 5,000 tomahawks at a time? I think that'll be a different story then. So they have definite concern on the NATO side. When you talk to them, they do not want that scenario, but the only thing they don't have is fear. That's why they're not afraid. They will continue fighting, if need be. Other thing is that modern armies are armies of one operation, and you need to have stockpiled enough resources for longer term because they have all these high-precision munitions, but maybe for 1 or 2 operations when you actually might have to fight that in a protracted time scale. But the volume of resources for the first 2 operations is so big that after them, one can pose the right question, how much of a potential Russia would have left to continue any fighting. So NATO still has definite advantage, and Russian leadership understands that too. And that's why propaganda statements is one thing, but real plans are another. They tried to ride into this year on some blackmail, but they were immediately shown their place and shown that blackmail would not fly. So it's a question to be seen, what will they do as an answer, how pressure will be exerted from Russian sides. But I think there are still logical persons somewhere there in Putin's group And when certain events happen at the front, if they get their butts kicked, they probably will carry out the lessons from this situation, even theoretically. We understand that, Alexey. So why, if it is plus minus that, when the question arises about NATO using certain military equipment, I'm talking about the missile that again flew on the territory of Poland or flew through the territory of Poland, that activity from NATO is not happening. Why do you think? It is a political decision. They are not carrying out active duty to be hitting down everything that flies across the border. Political decision cannot be made in 30 seconds. If it was flying deeper in Poland, or if they had at least 5 minutes to react, they would probably make that decision and shoot it down. But 39 seconds, when it's going on a trajectory of leaving the territory of Poland. You know, Polish helicopter last summer, I think, flew across the border with Belarus. It was not shot down as well. So these sides try to avoid incidents where it's not necessary. When in 2015, Turkish F-16 shot down Russian Su jet, highlighting where the red line goes for Putin. Some commentators saying that it was shot down in 10 seconds, but the problem was that it was flying there for weeks. It was bombing one of the mountain where there were some rebels ethnically close to Turkey, and it was going a little further because it's a huge mountain and it's not enough space to turn around under several Gs to avoid the territory of Turkey. So eventually it flew into the territory and cursed into the territory of Turkey, and they gave it some thought, but eventually shot it down. Poles did not have this opportunity, and even the couple fighters they had on duty, it might get there quickly, but in 39 seconds this is still technically difficult. So, of course, you can make those memes and poke our partners on the NATO side, our beloved Poles, but on the level of serious conversations, it doesn't make sense to accuse them that they're not shooting down that. Even technically it's difficult, plus political decision has not been made. And both sides are trying to avoid escalations, and rightly so. So another thing we need to say to Poles and the whole NATO, give us support our air defense, and we'll make sure that nothing ever gets to your border. We're already fighting those troops, so it's easier to shoot down them on the territory of Ukraine than wait and then make political decisions whether to shoot it or not. All right, regardless, in Poland, at least 30% of Polish citizens do not think that NATO will defend their country in case of armed collision with Russian Federation. This was the results of Pollster, ordered by Super Express newspaper. According to that polling, 30% expressed negative opinion on this question, 16% do not have any opinion, 50% said that they're sure that NATO will provide aid to Poland in case of hot war. So 30%. What do you think? Is it Poles slacking, or is it a new trend that we need to deal with somehow? Or let it be? Look, this is for Poles to decide. I do not see serious trouble here, because on one hand, every third is a little too much. On the other hand, 2/3 is good enough to carry out the modern war. And then it's a question to Poland internally. And Poland actually is writing anti-Brussels politics against the EU, so there could be some skepticism in relation to their current political vector, which is not officially acknowledged. And then they're also looking at Ukraine across the border, and they understand that NATO is not really helping Ukraine much, so they have their concerns. But that's NATO weakness, and that can be resolved in joint training operations that are now being carried out there. When they have American division in the open, then of course they can change their mind about believing in NATO. So NATO just needs to highlight more of their actions in Poland and with their neighboring countries. That's my advice to Polish colleagues, because one can
perhaps believe that NATO will not come. But if NATO is already there, do you think they'll retreat without carrying a fight? This is a more complex proposition for propaganda to imprint on the easy-to-believe part of population. Yeah, so I don't see a big problem with that. All right, thank you. End of part 1.